They were the men who built America's under-nightlife. From the rain-slick streets of Chicago to the silent backrooms of Brooklyn, three names shaped a century of shadows: Capone, Luciano, and Gambino. They ruled with whispers, not bullets. They drew maps no law could follow. And when the world called them criminals, they just smiled, because they knew the truth. You can outlaw the drink, but you can't outlaw the thirst. Tonight, as rain falls over sleeping cities, their stories return, softened by time, told in calm voices for restless hearts. No violence, no noise, just the echoes of ambition under a midnight sky. So put on your headphones, dim the lights, and let the rain carry you through the untold dreams of America's most mysterious empire. Rain has a sound in Chicago that never quite stops. It starts as a whisper against the rooftops, a soft tapping over the empty streets, then folds itself into the heartbeat of the city. That night in 1919, it was still falling when a train pulled into Union Station and a young man stepped off, carrying nothing but a worn coat and a restless hunger. His name was Al Capone, 20 years old, Brooklyn-born, a scar curling down his cheek like a punctuation mark left by life itself. He didn't look like a legend, just another kid chasing work after the war. But the war that mattered to him had nothing to do with soldiers. It was the war between thirst and the law. Prohibition had just begun. Bars went dark, breweries were shuttered, and the city, so proud, so loud, found itself parched. The papers called it morality. The people called it nonsense. And in the quiet, men like Johnny Torrio saw an opportunity dripping through the cracks. Torrio had sent Capone west, whispering, "Go to Chicago. See if the city's ready to drink again." It was. The city had been ready before the ink dried on the law. The cab that carried Capone from the station rattled down streets glazed with rain. Street lamps turned every puddle into melted gold. Coal smoke curled above the rooftops, and behind shuttered windows, phonographs played jazz at half volume, music that didn't need permission. Capone pressed his hand against the glass and watched the world blur. He didn't smile. He just nodded to himself as if the city had already spoken. At a small boarding house near 35th Street, an old woman handed him a brass key. "The roof leaks," she said. He looked up at the ceiling and shrugged. "I don't mind a little rain." That night he sat by the window, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark, and listened to the water drip through the plaster. Somewhere beyond the tracks, a train moaned. Somewhere closer, laughter rose from a speakeasy pretending to be a barber shop. Chicago wasn't sleeping, it was waiting for someone to tell it what came next. The next day smelled of wet pavement and coffee. Capone sat in a diner, hat low, listening to the chatter. Everyone complained about prices, about the weather, about missing their beer. He smiled. Every complaint was a market signal. That night, he followed Torrio's instructions to a dim cafe with covered windows. Men sat around small tables, coats damp, eyes sharper than their knives. They weren't gangsters yet, just merchants in a new economy. Whispers traded faster than money. When someone said liquor, heads turned like sunflowers to the light. Capone kept silent. He watched, memorized. Torrio had told him, "Learn the room before you speak. The loudest man gets remembered by cops." Later, a thin man with restless fingers leaned close. "Tomorrow night," he said, "you'll see how Chicago drinks." Midnight. The river smelled of rust and cold smoke. A truck reversed toward a warehouse door, headlights dimmed. Men in caps rolled barrels off the bed, the wood slick with rain. Capone stood near the entrance, rain dripping off his brim, counting each barrel under his breath. He liked the order in it, the rhythm that promised control. Then a car appeared at the edge of the lot. Engines paused. Hands twitched toward pockets. Before tension could break, a voice called out through the rain. "Easy, boys. It's just me." A figure stepped from the car, umbrella tilted like a crown, Johnny Torrio himself. He grinned, small and calm. "Didn't think I'd let my best shipment arrive without a blessing." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The barrels were safe, the deal done, and Torrio's empire had officially begun to breathe. He looked at Capone, hand firm on the young man's shoulder. "Remember this sound?" he said. "The rain. That's the city talking. Every drop that falls tonight is money if you know how to catch it." Capone nodded. He didn't know it yet, but that sentence would follow him for the rest of his life. Weeks blurred into months. He learned every crooked street between the stockyards and the loop, every cop who winked for an envelope, every alley that smelled of whiskey and wet brick. He learned to listen more than speak. He learned that power didn't shout, it nodded. At night, back in his small rented room, the roof still leaked. He'd lie awake, cigarette ember fading, listening to the steady rhythm of water in the bowl he'd set on the floor. The sound was oddly peaceful, like the city whispering, "Keep going." Sometimes he'd think of Brooklyn, of his mother lighting candles for her son. He'd murmur, "It's only business, Ma," though no one was there to hear. Business. That word made everything simpler. One night, Torrio drove him along Lake Michigan. The shoreline glowed under a veil of fog. "You see that skyline?" Torrio said. "Every window has a thirst. Our job is to quench it without drowning in it." Capone watched the reflections ripple over the dark water. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Torrio continued softly, "Someday I'll step aside. When I do, the man who runs Chicago will be the one who keeps the peace," quietly. "You think you can do that, kid?" Capone looked out at the lake and said, "Yeah, quiet's easy." He would be wrong about that, but it sounded true under the rain. Autumn crept in. The smell of smoke thickened and the city's light turned amber and slow. Capone moved into a better apartment, one with solid walls and no leaks, but he still missed the sound of dripping water. Silence felt too clean, too honest. On quiet nights, he'd pour a glass from a hidden bottle and watch the lights of Chicago through the window. He'd think about how every one of those lights represented someone breaking the same law he was. He wasn't corrupting the city. He was reflecting it. A man who once polished Torrio's car started calling him Boss Al. The nickname stuck. Not because he demanded it, but because he never had to. By Christmas, snow covered the city like a secret it couldn't quite hide. Streetcars hissed along rails, bells clanging softly in the fog. Capone walked alone past closed taverns, hands in pockets, breath curling white. Through frosted windows he saw families laughing, drinking from cups labeled tea. He smiled. Everyone pretended. Everyone drank. He stopped at a corner where the river cut through the city's heart. The surface shimmered with reflected light. He could almost hear the echo of Torrio's words, "Every drop that falls tonight is money." But standing there, with snow melting on his coat, it felt like something larger. Destiny maybe, or the simple truth that the world always finds its vice again. He flicked his cigarette into the dark water and watched the ember fade. Above him, the skyline pulsed like a sleeping beast. Years later, people would call him a monster, a king, a cautionary tale. But on that first night, he was just a young immigrant chasing warmth in a cold city, listening to the rain, learning its rhythm, believing he could turn it into a song of his own. So as you drift tonight, let the rain outside your window take his place. Imagine that dim boarding house room, that scar-faced kid sitting by the glass, whispering his plans to a city that never really sleeps. The same rain that touched his window still falls tonight, steady, patient, endless. And maybe if you listen closely, you'll hear Chicago take another quiet drink. The rain in New York never sounds like Chicago. It's thinner, more hesitant, drops that fall between the rails of the elevated line and vanish into steam. Brooklyn, 1930. The streets of Bensonhurst smelled of roasted chestnuts, damp newspapers, and the tired salt from the harbor. Men walked with their collars up, not from the cold but from habit. Everyone was watching someone. In a third-floor apartment above a bakery lived a man few people noticed. He was quiet, neat, always paid in cash. When neighbors greeted him, he nodded politely and said nothing more. His name was Carlo Gambino, and in a world obsessed with loud names, Capone, Luciano, Dutch Schultz, he moved like fog, shapeless, steady, impossible to catch. He had come to America as a teenager from Palermo, one of 1,000 sons of Sicily who arrived with empty pockets and unbreakable patience. In Sicily, power had spoken through whispers. In Brooklyn, it still did. By 1930, America's experiment with Prohibition was beginning to crack. The newspapers called it a noble failure. The speakeasies still poured, the trucks still rolled, and the cops still cashed envelopes that smelled faintly of whiskey. Capone ruled Chicago. Luciano was rebuilding Manhattan. And in the quiet between them, Gambino waited, watching how the storm moved before he stepped into the rain. He started small. A bakery delivery here, a warehouse guard job there. Then came the invitations. A cousin's wedding, a friend's christening, a dinner behind closed doors where every toast sounded like an oath. Carlo never refused. He listened more than he spoke. That was his gift, the discipline to let silence do the work. One night, after a gathering in a basement lit by a single bare bulb, an older man approached him. "You don't talk much," the man said. Gambino shrugged. "Talking changes nothing." The man smiled. "Then maybe you belong with us." Brooklyn was a maze of loyalty. At its center stood the Castellamarese War, an invisible battle between old-world bosses and the new blood that wanted change. People disappeared without noise. Doors stayed locked. Carlo watched, waited, measured. While others fought for headlines, he built relationships. Small debts, small favors, threads that could later weave a net. When the smoke cleared, lucky Luciano had created a new order, the Commission. And in that new order, Carlo Gambino was assigned to the Anastasia family, a position that looked ordinary, forgettable. Just how he liked it. He spent his days at the docks. Freighters arrived heavy with coffee, sugar, and secrets. Carlo learned the schedules, the inspectors, the way money moved faster than paperwork. At night, he returned home to his wife, Catherine, and their children. He helped with homework, kissed their foreheads, and then sat by the window, listening to ships' horns echo over the harbor. Neighbors thought he was an accountant. He let them think it. Anonymity was armor. Every so often, a black car would stop outside, and a man would climb the stairs for a quiet conversation. No shouting. No threats. Just low voices and careful nods. When the visitor left, Catherine would ask, "Business?" He'd smile faintly. "Just friends talking about bread." She never asked again. Years passed. Prohibition ended, but the hunger it created did not. Now the business was labor unions, construction contracts, shipping. The same rhythm, just a different tune. One winter night, Carlo met Albert Anastasia at a pier closed for repairs. Anastasia was all energy, quick eyes, quicker temper. They stood in the wind as snow drifted sideways. Anastasia said, "I like you, Carlo. You don't make noise." Carlo nodded. "Noise brings notice." Anastasia laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Stick close to me. You'll go far." Carlo did stick close, but not too close. He had already learned the first law of survival. Never stand where lightning might strike. Brooklyn changed with the decades. Streetcars vanished, buses replaced them, radios brought Sinatra into every kitchen. But Gambino remained a silhouette at the edge of photographs, always one step behind the camera. When Anastasia grew reckless, flashing wealth, drawing headlines, Carlo grew quieter still. The year everything turned. A meeting upstate in a little town called Appalachian. Meant to be secret, meant to be safe. It wasn't. The cops raided. Men ran through the woods in tailored suits. Anastasia's empire trembled. And a month later, Albert was gone. Barbershop chair, morning paper, and a story told in whispers. Carlo said nothing. He attended the funeral, bowed his head, offered condolences. The next week he was running the family. No coronation. No blood oath shouted to the sky. Just quiet acceptance, like fog filling an empty street. The newspapers didn't even use his photo at first. They called him the Gentle Don, the Ghost of Brooklyn. He liked those names. They meant people were still guessing. Power, he believed, wasn't in the threat. It was in the routine. The morning walk, the polite handshake, the envelope that arrived on time. He managed labor unions the way a priest manages faith, softly, through repetition. When rivals cursed him for taking too much, he'd simply smile and invite them to dinner. If they accepted, they lived. If they didn't, they usually moved, voluntarily or otherwise. No one ever proved which. At home, Catherine still made pasta every Sunday. Their sons brought grandchildren to kiss his cheek. He read the paper slowly, clipping articles about arrests and new mayors. Sometimes he'd hum an old Sicilian tune, one his mother used to sing when the wind blew from the sea. He liked the way it sounded under the hum of the refrigerator, modern noise wrapped around an ancient melody. He never talked about the business. He never needed to. By then, his decisions traveled farther than words. In 1965, the FBI finally gave him a nickname, the capo of all bosses. They said it with frustration because they couldn't prove a thing. He still paid his taxes, still drove his own car, still smiled for neighbors who brought cannoli at Christmas. He'd become what Torrio once told Capone to be, the calmest man in the room. The difference was Carlo never stopped being calm. One evening, long after midnight, he sat on his porch in Howard Beach. The rain was falling again, thin and patient, tapping against the wooden steps. He held a cup of espresso and watched the streetlights blur through it. Inside, the radio played Sinatra softly. It was a very good year. He thought of the faces that had passed through his life. Capone's grin in a newspaper photo, Luciano's eyes across a hotel table, Torrio's hand on a young man's shoulder in the rain. 3 different kinds of kings. He'd outlived them all by staying small. He smiled at that thought, not pride exactly but recognition. The city rewarded the patient. It always had. He whispered to himself in Italian first, then in English so the night could hear. Silence is stronger than bullets. A car passed, tires hissing through puddles. He sipped the last of his coffee, then went inside, turning off the porch light behind him. The street returned to darkness and the rain kept falling, steady as breath. Narrator's close. And so, listener, as you lie beneath your own rain tonight, think of him. The man who built an empire not from fire, but from quiet. In the story of American crime, his name rarely shouted. It simply endured. Brooklyn forgot his footsteps, but not his method. Because somewhere, in every city that never truly sleeps, there's still a man at a window watching the storm, believing that patience is the purest form of power. Let the rain carry you deeper into that thought. Let it wash over the noise of the day. And when you close your eyes, remember, not every legend is loud. Some conquer the night by whispering. New York never really sleeps. It only changes its dreams. By 1931, the city was wrapped in electric glow, a fever that stretched from the jazz clubs of Harlem to the mirrored bars of Times Square. The war was over, Prohibition was faltering, and the streets hummed with a nervous sort of freedom. Everyone wanted to be somebody. And in a suite on the 12th floor of the Waldorf Astoria, one man was quietly deciding who would be allowed to be. His name was Charlie Lucky Luciano. He liked hotel rooms because they were neutral ground, carpeted silence, crisp linen, the hum of a city below that never stopped moving. No one ruled a city from an alley. Power was cleaner than that. Power needed polish. That night, rain drummed softly on the windows while a jazz record played from a phonograph near the bed. The notes floated like smoke. Luciano poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, even though it was still illegal. Habit. Or maybe defiance. Across from him sat Meyer Lansky, small, sharp, unblinking, the numbers man. On the other side, Frank Costello, tie loosened, cigarette balanced between fingers that never trembled. The 3 of them could have been any group of businessmen discussing contracts. And in a way they were. Luciano leaned back, the city's light painting gold across his sleeve. The old ways are finished, he said quietly. Too many bosses, too many wars. Capone brought heat in Chicago. Maranzano brought blood to Brooklyn. If we keep fighting, Washington's gonna do what none of us could, wipe us all out. Lansky nodded, eyes reflecting the phonograph's spin. You thinking what I'm thinking? Luciano smiled. Always. He rose, walked to the window. Below, Manhattan pulsed like an electric heartbeat. He touched the glass, tracing invisible lines from the Bronx to Brooklyn, from the docks to the speakeasies of the village. This city, he said, it ain't built on fear. It's built on understanding. We stop calling it the mob. We start calling it a business. We stop being tribes. We start being a commission. The word hung in the air like incense. Outside, thunder rolled down the Hudson, low and steady. In that sound was everything the night would remember, the birth of order in a world that had thrived on chaos. Luciano didn't invent crime, he organized it. He understood that people obey structure even when the law fails to give it. He didn't want to be a king. Kings die. He wanted a system that lived forever. He turned back toward the table. We set boundaries, he said. No family moves on another without approval. Disputes get handled like gentlemen. 5 families, 5 votes. I don't want to see another boss end up in a barber chair. Costello exhaled smoke. You think they'll listen? Luciano's grin was soft, almost kind. They'll listen. Everyone sleeps somewhere. We just decide where the lights go out first. By morning, the storm had cleared. New York smelled of wet stone and roasted chestnuts from the street vendors returning to work. Luciano watched from the balcony as men unfolded newspapers that already carried headlines about someone else's downfall. He sipped his coffee and smiled. The world moved fast, but he had just given it a map. That afternoon he took a walk through Little Italy. The same block where he'd once shined shoes now hosted quiet men in overcoats nodding as he passed. He didn't stop. He didn't have to. Respect was a shadow that followed him without sound. He met Thomas Dewey once, the young prosecutor who would later bring him down. At the time, Dewey was still just another ambitious man with polished shoes. Luciano noticed how Dewey avoided eye contact when shaking hands. That told him everything. Fear disguised as righteousness. He'd seen it 100 times before. That night, back at the Waldorf, he told Lansky, "They don't hate us for breaking laws. They hate us for writing our own." Lansky didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken. For a while, the city worked exactly as he'd planned. The commission balanced everything: profit, peace, and pride. Each family had its territory, its rhythm, its silence. There were still whispers, still bullets, but they belonged to a code now, a code that allowed the city to breathe. Luciano became less visible. He preferred the quiet of hotel suites, the click of typewriter keys, the soft chime of telephones. Power didn't come from guns anymore, it came from knowing which door to knock on. In the evenings he'd walk through the lobby, hat tilted low, raincoat folded neatly over his arm. To the staff he was Mr. Charles Lucania, a businessman from nowhere staying indefinitely. He'd tip well, smile politely, disappear behind elevator doors that carried him back into legend. But power, like rain, eventually seeps through. By 1936, the government needed a victory, and Luciano became the headline they'd been craving. Dewey built his case, the papers sharpened their pens, and soon the man who once organized America's underworld found himself in chains on a train to Dannemora. The cell was small. The rain still found him there, drumming against the bars, whispering the same tune it had in Manhattan. He would spend 10 years listening to it, and yet even in prison the structure held. The commission kept running. Decisions still carried his signature, passed through coded letters and loyal visitors. The shadow he'd built was bigger than any wall. In 1946, after helping the U.S. Navy during the war, Luciano was released and deported to Italy. He left New York behind, but not really. Part of him stayed in every quiet backroom, every bar that paid its bills in cash, every man who believed silence was safer than truth. From a balcony in Naples, he could see the sea at dusk, its color the same dull steel as the Hudson. He thought about the city across the ocean, the skyline, the rain, the way it never slept. Sometimes he'd whisper, "Keep it running," as if the city could still hear him. Years later, when journalists asked who he thought had replaced him, he'd smile and say, "Nobody replaces anybody. The system replaces the man." He understood something most people never do, that immortality isn't living forever, it's leaving a pattern that does. Narrator's close. And now, listener, as you lie in the dark, hear the faint hum of traffic beneath your own window, the drip of rain on the glass. That sound once filled a hotel room where a young man redrew the lines of power. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just listened, to the city, to the rain, to the inevitable. Let the sound take you there, to a night of soft thunder, polished floors, and a single lamp burning above a map of Manhattan. The storm outside is the same storm inside us all, restless but full of possibility. Sleep well, friend. Tomorrow the city will wake, but tonight it still belongs to the rain. The rain had changed since the night Al Capone first came to Chicago. It used to sound like applause, sharp, alive, full of promise. Now, 2 decades later, it fell slower, heavier, as if the city itself were sighing. In the spring of 1932, Chicago was quieter, at least on the surface. The speakeasy still poured gin, but the laughter had turned cautious. The stock market had collapsed. Even crime felt the depression. And Capone, once the thunder that rolled across the skyline, sat alone inside his mansion in Palm Island, far from the streets that once shouted his name. He was 40-something, but he looked older. The world had moved on, and he was learning how to live without the noise. The house was big enough to echo. Palm trees leaned in the humid wind. The rain tapped gently on the bay windows, a softer rhythm than the gunfire that used to mark his nights. Nurses moved quietly through the halls. He wasn't the Scarface the newspapers remembered. He was just Mr. Capone, retired. Sometimes, when the storms rolled in from the Atlantic, he'd step onto the porch, watching lightning flash across the horizon. The thunder reminded him of Chicago, the trains, the sirens, the crowds outside the Lexington Hotel. He'd close his eyes and smell it again. Wet brick, cigar smoke, whiskey. Memory had its own kind of rain. In his mind he'd walk those streets again. Madison, Clark, Cicero. He could still hear Torrio's voice, "Keep your nights quiet, kid." And for a while he had. Until the city made him forget what quiet sounded like. Back then the money had flowed like music. Politicians at his tables, cops on his payroll, reporters asking for quotes as if he were a movie star. He'd laugh and slap their backs, play the part. He believed that if you smiled wide enough, no one would notice the blood on your shoes. For a while it worked, until it didn't. The first real silence came in 1931. The courtroom, the verdict, the sentence. 11 years. Tax evasion, they called it. Capone had faced men with Tommy guns, judges with warrants, priests with warnings, but nothing felt as final as that single word, guilty. Alcatraz was a long way from Chicago. Cold, wet, gray. Even the sea there felt like punishment. The guards called him Capone with no respect, no fear. The echo of his shoes on the concrete was the only applause he'd hear for years. Some nights he'd sit in his cell, tapping his finger against the bars, trying to find the rhythm of rain. He'd imagine Cicero rooftops, the sound of water dripping through the night, and pretend he was home. He served 7 years. By the time he walked free, the world had changed. Torrio was gone. Luciano had taken the throne in Manhattan. Gambino was just beginning to weave his quiet empire in Brooklyn. Capone returned to Florida a sick man, syphilis eating away at his mind. The doctor spoke softly as if words could bruise him. But even illness couldn't erase everything. He still remembered the way the city glittered after rain. He still remembered how it felt to walk into a room and know that every breath in it waited for his command. Now all that waited was the weather. One evening, his wife May found him sitting by the piano, fingers resting on the keys though he hadn't played in years. She asked, "What are you thinking about, Al?" He smiled faintly. "About the rain back home," he said. "It was colder there but cleaner." She brushed his shoulder, said nothing. There was nothing left to fix, only to remember. Sometimes old friends visited, a driver, a cousin, a lawyer with careful words. They'd sit on the porch and talk about fishing or baseball. Never business. The business was gone. The empire had melted away like sugar in coffee. But occasionally, when the light was low and the sea breeze carried a chill, Capone would lean close and whisper, "You know, it wasn't all bad. We gave people what they wanted. That's all. We just gave it a little faster." No one argued. It was easier to let a legend tell his own bedtime story. The press still wrote about him, the rise and fall of Scarface. They called him ruthless, brilliant, tragic. They forgot he'd once been a boy watching rain slide down a Brooklyn window, dreaming of something bigger. History never remembers the waiting, only the storm. One morning, a journalist sent a letter requesting an interview. Capone dictated a reply to his nurse. He said, "Tell him I'm out of business. Tell him I'm just trying to learn how to be left alone." Then he added, almost playfully, "But if he writes, tell him to make me look good. Tell him to make it sound like I won." That night, thunder woke the house. Capone shuffled to the porch again, wrapping a blanket over his shoulders. The rain poured hard, bouncing off the bay, shimmering under the faint porch light. He listened to it like a sermon. He thought about the men he'd known, Torrio, Gambino, Luciano, all architects of invisible empires. Each one had built a kingdom under rain, and each one had vanished like mist when the sun came up. Maybe that was the rule of their world, nothing eternal but the weather. He whispered into the night, "You win for a while, then you fade. That's the deal." The rain answered softly, indifferent. In his final years, the doctor said his mind drifted. Some days he believed he was back in Chicago, running deliveries through the alleys. Other days he thought the nurses were his old crew. But whenever it rained, he grew calm, almost lucid. He'd hum an old Italian tune under his breath and say, "Hear that? That's the city talking." May would nod, smile, and let him drift. January 1947. The last storm rolled in heavy over Palm Island. The nurses moved quietly, the house lights flickered in the wind. Capone lay in bed, half awake, half remembering. He whispered something about the Lexington Hotel, about the sound of boots on wet marble floors. Then he fell still. The rain kept falling long after he was gone. Maybe it was Chicago's way of saying goodbye. Maybe it was just weather. But to anyone who'd ever known his name, that night felt heavier, quieter, as if a particular kind of thunder had finally left the world. Narrator's close. And now, listener, as you lie beneath your own storm, think of him. The boy who came west chasing a drink. The man who built a kingdom out of noise. The old soul who learned, too late, that silence was stronger. Outside your window, the rain might sound the same. A steady rhythm, a gentle fall. It's the sound every empire makes in the end. Let it soften your breathing. Let it wash away the noise of the day. And if you listen carefully, you might still hear the echo of Capone's city, Chicago, exhaling one last time beneath the endless rain. Sleep well. Rain was falling over Manhattan again. Soft, polite, the way it does when a city is trying to look innocent. It coated the windows of the Waldorf Astoria, tracing silver rivers through the reflection of the skyline. Inside one of the suites, 4 men sat around a round mahogany table that glowed beneath a single yellow lamp. No guards. No guns. Just silence thick enough to hold a decision. At the head sat Charlie "Lucky" Luciano. Next to him, Meyer Lansky, eyes like 2 polished coins. Opposite them, Frank Costello, cigarette smoke curling above his glass. And across the table, Joe Adonis, smiling the way men do when they already know the outcome. This was not a meeting about money. It was a meeting about order. For 20 years, America's underworld had lived by chaos, bosses warring like kings with broken crowns. Capone had ruled by fear, Maranzano by arrogance. Both had fallen. Luciano had watched, learned, and waited. Now, as thunder whispered beyond the glass, he spoke in a voice so low it barely disturbed the air. No more wars, he said. No more old country rules. We build something that lasts. Something clean. Lansky leaned forward. Structure? Luciano nodded. The commission. Each family gets a seat. 5 in New York. 1 in Chicago. 1 in Buffalo. No boss of bosses. Every vote counts. We share the streets, we share the peace. The men were quiet. Only the rain answered. He poured whiskey into 4 glasses. It wasn't for a toast, it was a contract. Each glass shimmered with the light of the city that had tried to outlaw it. This, Luciano said, lifting his glass, isn't about drinking. It's about understanding. We don't fight for territory. We build it together. You want to make money in Brooklyn? You go through Gambino. You want to move goods from Chicago? You talk to the outfit. We act like businessmen, not soldiers. Lansky's smile was almost proud. That's what I've been waiting to hear. Costello exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. And when somebody breaks the rules? Luciano's eyes didn't waver. Then we remind them who wrote them. Outside, the rain thickened, sliding down the stone faces of the Waldorf like tears from a sleeping giant. New York didn't know it yet, but history was being rewritten not by guns, but by men who understood quiet. Luciano opened a folder on the table. Maps, names, ledgers. Everything that mattered. He tapped his finger once. This is our Constitution. Every family gets a copy. Every deal goes through it. He looked to Lansky. You keep the numbers. Frank handles politics. Adonis keeps the streets sweet. Then he leaned back, smiling without warmth. And I make sure no one forgets who brought peace to New York. The others nodded. A rumble of thunder rolled through the building like a slow applause. Later that night, after the meeting broke up, Luciano stood alone by the window. Rain was still falling, but softer now, like the city was exhaling. He watched the streets below, taxis leaving trails of light, newspapers pressed to faces, umbrellas blooming like midnight flowers. The world looked peaceful again. And peace was exactly what he needed people to believe. Months passed. Rumors spread. The old-timers grumbled. But the blood stopped flowing so freely, and money started to move like a river without rocks. For the first time, New York was divided without being broken. Luciano had done the impossible. He'd turned the underworld into an institution. Cops kept chasing ghosts from another era. The real power now lived in ledgers, not alleys. He rarely gave orders anymore, he just made suggestions. People listened. Even politicians began to adopt his language: partnerships, councils, commissions. The city had learned his grammar without realizing it. One rainy afternoon, he visited a church in Little Italy alone. He lit a candle, watched its flame dance against the dark wood. A boy kneeling nearby looked up and recognized him but said nothing. Luciano smiled slightly. He'd built a religion of his own, one where money was faith and loyalty was sacrament. And in that moment, watching the candle burn, he understood something Torrio and Capone never had. It wasn't about owning the city. It was about organizing its sins. Then came the press. Headlines. Dewey. The prosecutor who saw him not as a man, but as a myth that needed ending. Luciano had avoided violence for years, but the law wanted a villain it could touch. When they couldn't find one, they invented him from whispers. He stood in court, hands folded neatly, smiling as the judge read his sentence. 50 years. The rain outside was relentless, a drumbeat for the end of an era. He turned to Lansky in the gallery and mouthed, "Keep it together." Even in chains, he still sounded like a chairman adjourning a meeting. Prison couldn't kill the commission. It ran without him, exactly as designed. Meetings moved from hotels to basements, from balconies to back rooms, but the structure remained untouched. Luciano's system had become self-aware, a shadow government with no capital, no flag, and no need for public approval. He built something so efficient it didn't need him anymore. That, he decided, was real power. When he was finally released a decade later, the world was different. Capone was gone. Gambino was rising. America was drunk on post-war optimism. But in every city where money met silence, his name still traveled like rain on a window pane, thin, persistent, everywhere. He sailed for Italy quietly, a free man without a home. Standing on deck, he watched the Atlantic stretch beneath him, a gray infinity. The wind smelled the same as Manhattan after a storm. He closed his eyes and said softly, "Still raining. Good. Means the machine's running." Narrator's close. And so, listener, as you rest tonight, picture that suite high above Manhattan. The lamp, the glasses of whiskey, the rain drawing lines across the window. That was where order was born from chaos. where men traded violence for rules and secrecy for structure. Outside your own window, rain still falls with the same rhythm. Every drop a reminder that even in the darkest systems, someone once tried to make sense of it all. Let that sound slow your breathing. Let it carry you into sleep. Because in every storm, there's a moment when the noise turns to music. And that's where the story always begins. Brooklyn, 1965. The rain that morning came down in a steady gray curtain, blurring the skyline into watercolor. The newspapers said there was a new man on top, but no one could agree on his name. The FBI called him the Quiet Dawn. The newspapers called him the Ghost. His neighbors just called him Mr. Gambino. He lived in a modest two-story home in Howard Beach, painted pale yellow, with roses climbing the fence and a flagstone path that glistened after rain. No guards, no cameras, no visible fortune. Just a man who looked like a retired grocer, feeding pigeons and reading the Times. And yet, from that small house, Carlo Gambino quietly ruled more men, more money, and more silence than any boss before him. The sound of routine. Every day began the same way. 6 a.m., coffee black, one piece of toast. A short walk down the block with his wife Catherine, umbrellas touching. They'd talk about grandchildren, about the church fundraiser, about nothing that mattered. That was the secret. He kept the ordinary sacred. Neighbors waved. He waved back. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and sent fruit baskets at Christmas. If the mailman slipped on the sidewalk, Gambino was the first to offer a hand. It wasn't kindness for show, it was camouflage. The louder the world became, the quieter he grew. Inside his study, the phone rarely rang. It didn't have to. Messages came folded inside envelopes from cousins, delivered with homemade cookies or a loaf of bread. No handwriting. No signatures. Just numbers that spoke their own language. He would read them slowly, nod once, and drop them into the fireplace. By the time the ash cooled, someone in another city had already acted on his unspoken answer. Invisible empire. The commission still existed, Luciano's invention. But under Gambino it became something else. Less counsel, more current. It moved beneath the surface of everything. Shipping, construction, garbage, even the docks where cargo containers hummed like giant coffins full of secrets. Gambino never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Men who worked for him said his silence was heavier than threats. When he finally did speak, his words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples reaching every shore. "You don't win by fear," he told a young associate once. "You win by consistency. Fear fades. Discipline doesn't." That was the difference between him and Capone. Capone ruled a city, Gambino tuned an instrument. Every note was money, every rest was safety. Dinner table law. Sunday dinners were mandatory. No business talk, only family. Pasta, red wine, soft laughter. Grandchildren chasing each other between chairs. To outsiders it looked like any Italian household. To insiders it was parliament disguised as love. Loyalty was measured in who showed up, who kissed his cheek first, who lingered last. When the plates were cleared and Catherine brought espresso, Carlo would lean back, half smiling. He'd ask about school grades, about church. Then quietly, between sips, a single question, simple, direct, would decide someone's future. No witnesses. No records. Just a family man checking on business. A new America. By the late 60s, the world was changing faster than any one man could predict. The Beatles on the radio, moon landings on TV, protests in the streets. But the underworld still moved to an older rhythm. Cash, respect, discretion. Gambino watched the news each night, shaking his head at the chaos. "They talk too much," he'd murmur. "All of them. Talking ruins everything." When Robert Kennedy declared war on organized crime, Gambino simply smiled. Wars were noisy, he was not. FBI agents tailed his car, logged his dinners, photographed his garden. All they ever caught was a man watering roses. One frustrated agent wrote in a report, "He acts like a retiree, but every time he smiles, someone gets promoted." They weren't wrong. The Anastasia lesson. He'd never spoken publicly about Albert Anastasia, the man whose throne he'd inherited after that infamous barbershop morning. But sometimes when the rain hit the windows just right, he'd think of him. The rage. The headlines. The downfall. Albert loved noise, he once told his nephew. Noise makes you famous. Then it makes you dead. Instead, Gambino built a culture of understatement. If someone asked, "Who's the boss?" the answer was always, "We all are." It wasn't humility, it was survival. The meeting in Queens. One night in 1970, the heads of the 5 families met quietly in a banquet hall after closing. No tuxedos, no champagne, Just coffee, rain outside, and tension thick as humidity. The issue was narcotics. Younger men wanted in. The profits were unimaginable. Gambino listened as they argued, his hands folded, eyes half closed. When the room finally fell quiet, he spoke softly. Drugs make money, yes, but they make enemies too. You sell poison, you get poison. Stick to unions, construction, ports. Slow money lasts longer. No one dared challenge him. And though heroin flooded other cities, Brooklyn stayed cleaner, for a while. His restraint became legend, the kind that doesn't sell newspapers but saves generations. Whispers in weddings. Power found its way even into celebrations. When his son married, senators sent gifts, judges sent cards, detectives waved from across the street pretending not to. The orchestra played Sinatra. The rain came at midnight, thin and polite, washing the streets outside the reception hall. Someone asked him that night, "Do you ever miss the old days?" He chuckled. "No, the old days were loud. Loud gets you caught." He raised his glass but didn't drink. A man with control doesn't need to prove it. The weight of silence. By the mid-1970s, his hair had thinned to silver. He still walked each morning, slower now, waving to the same neighbors who had long since stopped wondering. The FBI called him untouchable, not because he was invisible, but because he blended perfectly into view. He once told Catherine, "They can watch me all they want. They can't photograph silence." Sometimes he'd sit on the porch during storms, wrapped in a shawl, watching lightning over Jamaica Bay. Each flash reminded him of people he'd outlived, Luciano, Capone, Anastasia, even Torrio. He was the last echo of an age built on whispers. October 15, 1976. The rain returned, gentle, familiar. Gambino had dinner with family, pasta, espresso, laughter. He excused himself early, said he was tired. In his bedroom, he sat for a while listening to the rain on the roof. When Catherine checked later, he was gone, peaceful, eyes closed, the faintest smile on his lips. The quiet king of Brooklyn had slipped away without noise as he had lived. Outside, the storm moved east toward the ocean, washing his street clean. Aftermath. They buried him in a small ceremony. No limousines, no brass bands. Just family, umbrellas, the soft patter of rain on marble. Reporters waited outside hoping for a quote, but the family said nothing. Even in death, his silence held. Years later, when agents looked back at the files, they realized they never once caught his voice on tape. No recordings. No confessions. Just absence. An absence they learned can be louder than evidence. Narrators close. So now, listener, as the rain hums beyond your window, remember him. The man who conquered by standing still. Who turned the art of staying quiet into a lifetime of control. Brooklyn sleeps easier these days, but its rain still sounds the same. Each drop a secret, each gust of wind a whisper from an era that refused to shout. Let that quiet fill your room. Let it calm the pulse behind your eyelids. Because somewhere between thunder and stillness, between memory and rain, the quiet king still walks his block, coat buttoned, head low, ruling nothing but peace. Sleep well. The sea outside Naples had its own rhythm, slow, endless, and patient. When the wind shifted, it carried the scent of salt, olive trees, and something older than memory itself. From the balcony of a small seaside villa, an aging man sat watching waves crawl against the rocks. He wore a linen shirt open at the collar, a Panama hat tilted low, and dark glasses that hid eyes once sharp enough to command cities. His name was Salvatore Lucania, though the world still whispered the name Lucky Luciano. He'd been back in Italy for almost 2 decades. He told people he'd retired, but retirement never suited him. Men like him didn't stop. They faded into rhythm, a quieter business, a slower heartbeat, an exile softened by sea air and distance. The man in the mirror. Each morning he shaved carefully, though his hands trembled slightly. The mirror showed an older face, suntanned, lined, still proud. He'd whisper to his reflection, "You made it out, kid." Then he'd smile, a flash of the charm that once bent empires. But nights were different. When the wind turned cold, he'd hear the city again. New York. The horns, the rain, the hotel rooms filled with smoke and plans. He'd pour himself a drink, just one, and let memory play like an old phonograph. Sometimes he'd talk to the sea the way other men talk to God. "You ever miss it?" he'd ask. "The lights, the noise, the feeling that everyone in the world owed you a phone call?" The sea, as always, said nothing. Just kept breathing. Ghost calls from America. Letters arrived from across the Atlantic. Old friends, old enemies, sometimes both in the same envelope. They used code names now, our cousins in Brooklyn, our contacts in Havana. He read each letter slowly, tracing the loops of handwriting, as if he could still hear their voices behind the ink. Then he'd burn them in an ashtray, watching the smoke drift toward the open window. One letter mentioned Carlo Gambino. The quiet king had taken control, reshaped the commission into something smoother, quieter. Luciano nodded as he read. "Good," he murmured. He learned the music. He never resented those who came after. If anything, he felt proud. The architecture had survived. His rules still ruled, even from across an ocean. Afternoons in Naples. Most days he walked the promenade by the harbor. Tourists snapped photographs of fishermen hauling in nets. No one recognized him. To them, he was just another old man in a white suit feeding pigeons. He liked it that way. Anonymity was the luxury he'd never been able to afford in New York. Sometimes he'd stop at a cafe for espresso. The barista called him Signore Salvatore, and he liked the way it sounded, ordinary, peaceful. He'd read the Corriere della Sera, shake his head at the chaos of politics, and smile. In every country, power changed faces but kept the same habits. When rain came off the sea, he'd stay outside, letting it touch his skin. It reminded him of the old storms that used to beat against Manhattan glass. The nights when his decisions rewrote the underworld. Now, the only thing he controlled was the pace of his breathing. The visit. In 1959, a visitor arrived, Meyer Lansky. The reunion was quiet. They met on the villa's terrace overlooking the bay. Two old friends, two architects of a vanished kingdom. Lansky poured them coffee. "Looks good on you," he said, nodding toward the sea. Luciano smiled. "You think so? Sometimes it feels like a prison with better weather." They talked for hours. Not about money or politics, but about time. About how it moves like the tide, never stopping, only shifting direction. Lansky asked, "You ever miss it, Charlie?" Luciano didn't answer right away. He watched a fishing boat slide across the horizon. Finally he said, "You don't miss power. You miss purpose." Before dawn, Lansky left for the airport. Luciano stood at the gate, listening to the rain beginning again. He raised a hand in farewell but didn't wave. Gestures were for the living, not for legends. Whispers in the port. The Neapolitan police watched him closely. So did the Americans. Every move, every visitor, every phone call. They thought he was rebuilding something, a new commission, a Mediterranean branch. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. No one ever proved it. That was the beauty of experience, knowing how to look innocent even when you're not. At night, he'd sit by the radio, listening to faint American stations crackling across the Atlantic. Sinatra, news bulletins, baseball scores. Sometimes, a story about New York crime would drift through the static and he'd chuckle softly. "Still the same dance," he'd whisper. "Just new dancers." The girl with the camera. One evening, a young reporter from Rome came to interview him for a magazine piece about the old world's ghosts. She was nervous, polite, full of questions he'd heard 100 times. He invited her in, made espresso, told her stories that sounded like myths, half true, half memory. When she asked, "Do you regret anything?" He looked toward the balcony where the sea shimmered in the setting sun. "I regret nothing," he said softly, "except not learning how to sleep sooner." She laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Before she left, she asked to take a picture. He agreed, one photo, nothing more. The flash caught him mid-smile, a man both present and already fading. It would become the last photograph ever taken of Lucky Luciano. The final morning. January 26, 1962. Rain clouds gathered early over Naples. Luciano dressed carefully, gray suit, crisp tie, polished shoes. He was meeting a film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. He'd agreed mostly out of curiosity. At the airport cafe, he ordered espresso and water. The producer arrived late, full of energy and nervous charm. Luciano listened, nodding, smiling. When the man finished his pitch, Luciano said quietly, "You want a movie? Tell them it's not about crime. Tell them it's about choices." He stood to shake the man's hand. Then, without warning, he staggered. The cup tipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. He murmured something no one understood, then fell. By the time the ambulance arrived, the rain had begun. Soft, steady, the same rain that had followed him from Brooklyn to Chicago to Manhattan. Now it was falling over Naples, washing the last trace of him back into the sea. After the tide. They buried him quietly in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, back home among the people who had built his world. Gambino sent flowers. Lansky sent silence. No speeches, no headlines. Just rain again. And so ended the life of the man who gave the underworld its order, not in a blaze, not in blood, but in peace. Exiled, forgiven by no one, understood by few. A man who taught others how to control chaos, only to find serenity in isolation. Narrator's close. And now, listener, as you drift beneath your own rain, picture that balcony by the sea. A white chair, an old hat, the horizon melting into gray. Imagine him there. The architect of the commission. The exile who found his peace not in power but in the sound of waves. The rain you hear tonight might be the same rain that fell on his last morning, slow, rhythmic, eternal. Let it carry you away from the noise, away from the headlines, into the still water of a story that finally learned how to sleep. Because every empire ends. But the sea and the rain, they never do. Sleep well. Howard Beach, Queens. A quiet suburb, the kind of place where the sound of airplanes from JFK mixed with the laughter of children riding bikes along tree-lined streets. To most, it was just another corner of New York, calm, middle-class, forgettable. But behind a low white fence, in a modest two-story house with blue shutters and roses by the door, the last of the old kings lived his final days. Carlo Gambino was in his mid-70s now. His empire still stretched invisibly across docks, unions, and construction yards, but his world had narrowed to a kitchen, a garden, and a porch that looked out toward Jamaica Bay. The sea air smelled faintly of salt and asphalt. Most nights, rain drifted in off the Atlantic, tapping the window panes like an old friend who didn't need to be invited. The routine. He woke early, always before dawn. Coffee, 2 biscotti, silence. Sometimes Catherine joined him at the table, still half asleep. They didn't speak much, they didn't have to. After 50 years together, words were decoration. The newspaper arrived at 6. He read every page, politics, sports, obituaries, pausing longest at the small crimes tucked between advertisements. Old habits die hardest. He'd trace a headline with his fingertip, murmur, sloppy, and fold the page away. Then he'd step outside, breathing the damp air, watching the sun find its way through thin clouds. The neighbors knew him as Mr. G. He shook hands, donated to church raffles, slipped cash to widows who couldn't pay their bills. If an argument broke out on the block, he'd appear quietly, standing between voices until they softened. No threats, no police, just presence. Peace followed him like weather. The invisible crown. The commission still met, though rarely. Younger bosses came in dark cars, headlights off, parking 2 streets away. Inside the house, they'd drink espresso, speak in low tones, and leave before midnight. To the FBI agents watching from vans, it looked like family dinners. And in a way it was. Carlo no longer chased money, he managed harmony. Each family had its place, its rhythm. His rule was simple. If everyone eats, no one fights. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. A nod from him carried more weight than a dozen threats from other men. The weather of memory. Rain came often that year. He'd sit by the window, a blanket over his knees, the newspaper unopened on his lap. Outside, the garden swayed. He liked watching how the roses bent without breaking. Sometimes he thought of the past, Torrio, Luciano, Capone, each one a storm in his own time. He had outlasted them all by learning to be the calm that followed. Once, when his nephew asked how he'd survived, he said, "A storm spends itself. Silence doesn't." The boy didn't understand, not yet. But one day he would. The visit. In the summer of 1976, a priest from the local parish stopped by with homemade bread. He asked gently if Carlo had any regrets. The old man smiled. "Father, I've sinned, sure. But I never broke my word. That must count for something." The priest nodded. "Do you still pray?" Carlo looked toward the rain sliding down the glass. "Every day. I just don't always use words." Evenings by the bay. When the weather cleared, he liked to sit on the porch and watch planes lift from JFK, silver against the pink sky. Sometimes he'd count them. 1, 2, 3, each a reminder of how small the world had become. In his youth, power meant borders. Now it meant patience. Catherine would bring him espresso, kiss his temple, whisper, "Come inside, it's getting cold." He'd shake his head. Not yet. The night's still thinking. He believed that the city never truly slept, it only murmured in its dreams. And he wanted to hear every word. The FBI's futile watch. Across the street, agents kept vigil. Different faces, same boredom. They recorded comings and goings, logged deliveries of groceries, noted visits from grandsons. One rookie asked his supervisor, "Why guard an old man feeding pigeons?" The older agent shrugged. "Because the pigeons report to him." They never caught him saying anything illegal. No wiretap ever caught more than laughter, prayers, or recipes. His empire lived in tone, not language. October 15, 1976. That day began like every other. Light rain, coffee, silence. By afternoon, the sky cleared and the air smelled of autumn. He had dinner with his family, pasta, salad, a slice of cake for one of the grandchildren's birthdays. He told a story about Sicily, about the lemon trees outside his boyhood home. Everyone laughed when he forgot the ending. He laughed too. Later, he excused himself, saying, "I'm going to rest a bit." He walked upstairs, paused halfway to look out the window. The rain had started again, soft, familiar. He smiled, whispered something only the night heard, and kept climbing. When Catherine checked an hour later, he was sitting in his chair, eyes closed, breathing easy. The radio beside him played faint jazz. Outside, the garden shimmered under drizzle. He had slipped away quietly, without witnesses, without warning. The quiet king of Brooklyn had left the room. The funeral. They buried him in the same cemetery as Luciano, two architects of opposite temperaments resting under the same gray sky. Rain fell as if on schedule. Reporters waited outside the gates, notebooks open, searching for a quote. None came. When the service ended, one of his grandsons whispered, "Grandpa liked rain." Catherine smiled through her tears. It always made the world quieter for him. The legacy. After his death, power shifted again, as it always does. The commission met without fanfare, voted in new names, new faces. But the tone he'd set endured, measured, methodical, calm. The machine he had refined kept humming, smooth as ever. Agents still talk about him in training sessions. They say he taught the underworld how to disappear in plain sight. That the most dangerous sound in history wasn't gunfire, but silence at a dinner table. And on quiet nights in Brooklyn, when the rain begins to fall, some swear they still feel it. That hush in the air, that invisible hand keeping order long after the man himself was gone. Narrator's close. So now, listener, as you lie beneath your own storm, imagine that little house on Howard Beach. The roses, the porch light, the rain tracing silver lines down the window. Inside, an old man sits with a cup of espresso, listening to a city that never stops whispering. He isn't planning anymore. He isn't ruling. He's just listening to the same rhythm that once carried him through a lifetime of storms. Let that rhythm carry you too. Let it soften your thoughts, slow your breath. Because peace isn't silence, it's knowing when to stop speaking. And somewhere between thunder and dawn, Brooklyn still remembers him, the man who ruled everything by saying nothing. Sleep well. Night has a way of folding history into silence. Cities forget, but not completely. They keep certain voices locked away, beneath pavement, beneath memory, beneath the hum of rain. If you listen closely, you can still hear them. Tonight, the rain is falling over 3 cities at once. Chicago, Manhattan, Brooklyn. Each with its own rhythm, its own ghost. In the shadow of the old Lexington Hotel, puddles form where Capone's empire once stood. The neon signs are gone, the speakeasies replaced by parking lots, but the air still smells faintly of whiskey and ambition. A cab splashes through the intersection. Inside, a driver hums a jazz tune he doesn't know came from the 1920s. The sound bounces off wet glass and lingers. Some say that's how spirits travel, on echoes. If you stand there long enough, you might hear laughter under the rain. Deep, confident, slightly arrogant. Capone's voice, maybe. Talking to no one and everyone. They said I was too loud. It murmurs, but noise built this town. You can't hide forever behind silence. Somebody has to make the first toast. Then the voice fades, like a radio losing its signal, leaving only the hum of the streetlights and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. Far east, Manhattan glows under drizzle. The towers rise like candles in a cathedral made of fog. From high above the Waldorf Astoria, the rain taps against the windows of empty suites, rooms that once smelled of cigar smoke, leather, and new plans. In one of those rooms, Lucky Luciano once dreamed up his empire. Now only the wallpaper remembers. Sometimes the elevator doors open by themselves on the 12th floor, even when no one calls them. The attendants laugh about it, say it's the ghost of some old guest who never checked out. But when the rain's just right and thunder rolls down the Hudson, they swear they hear a low voice in the corridor. Structure, it says. Keep it clean. Make it last. Luciano's creed, whispered into the bones of the building. The city followed it long after he was gone. Even Wall Street, in its own way, learned from him. Order from chaos, control from illusion. Down on Park Avenue, a businessman rushes through the storm, phone pressed to his ear, shouting deals into static. He doesn't know he's standing on the same sidewalks that once defined another kind of commission. History repeats, just with better suits. Across the East River, Brooklyn glistens beneath the same gray sky. The rain here is softer, older, as if it remembers to fall slowly. In Howard Beach, the house with the blue shutters still stands. The roses are gone now, replaced by trimmed hedges and a modern fence. New family. New lives. But the porch creaks the same way in the wind. Neighbors say sometimes, when the weather turns and the clouds drift in from the bay, you can hear a man's footsteps on the porch even though no one's there. 2 slow steps. Pause. Then the faint sound of a chair being pulled out. A sigh. Keep it steady, the ghost whispers. Don't rush. There's time for everything. Carlo Gambino's lessons still hang in the air of that block. Patience, composure, control. The storm may have ended decades ago, but the calm he built never really left. If you could listen to the rain across all 3 cities at once. The steady beat in Chicago. The metallic hiss in Manhattan. The gentle rhythm in Brooklyn. You might swear they're speaking to each other. Capone's laughter. Luciano's reasoning. Gambino's silence. 3 dialects of power echoing through time. Capone says, "You win with noise. The city loves noise." Luciano answers, "No, you win with order. Even chaos must be organized." Gambino concludes, "No. You win by letting them think you're not playing." And somewhere between those voices, the rain itself starts to sound like applause. Not loud but respectful. The kind given at the end of a long, perfect performance. Under Manhattan, beneath miles of concrete and history, old tunnels still hum with forgotten energy. They say if you walk there long enough, you find a locked iron door, a vault with no handle. No one knows who built it. Some say it holds money. Others say it holds memories. But on certain nights, when the rain above seeps through the cracks and echoes down the tunnels, you can hear faint voices behind that door. Soft, calm, conversational. Was it worth it? One asks. Depends, another replies. Did they remember the rules? A third voice chuckles. They're still arguing about them. Then silence. The vault closes again. History goes back to pretending it doesn't know their names. In a small security booth near the old docks of Red Hook, a night watchman sits listening to the rain hit the tin roof. He doesn't know why he likes that sound so much. Maybe it reminds him of something older than himself. He turns on a small radio to fill the silence, but the signal fades. For a second, the static shapes itself into a melody, jazz from another century. He smiles, unaware that he's humming along with ghosts. All cities dream. Chicago dreams of redemption. Manhattan dreams of control. Brooklyn dreams of peace. And somewhere in those dreams, the 3 of them meet again. Not as criminals, not as legends, but as men sitting around a table one last time. No whiskey. No smoke. Just rain outside and cards on the table. Capone deals. Luciano counts. Gambino watches. We built it, Capone says. We organized it, Luciano adds. We learned to let it go, Gambino finishes. Then the dream fades. The rain slows. The room dissolves into mist. You too are part of this story now. Because every time someone listens to their names, in a documentary, in a story before sleep, in a whisper shared between cities, the rain starts again. The vault opens. The echoes return. Not as warnings, not as praise, but as reminders that history isn't about the noise. It's about what survives after the noise ends. Narrator's close. So, listener, as you drift into your own rain tonight, remember this. Every storm leaves behind a pattern, a rhythm only the quiet can hear. In that rhythm, 3 men still exist, not in violence but in the hush that follows it. Capone the thunder. Luciano the architect. Gambino the silence. Together they became something larger than life. A single heartbeat of America's underworld, echoing softly beneath the rain. Let that sound carry you now. Let it slow your breath. Steady your thoughts, guide you towards sleep. Because the rain never forgets, and neither does the night. Sleep well. The rain hasn't stopped for 100 years. Not really. It just travels, from city to city, from one name to the next, falling on the same streets that once carried whispers instead of headlines. Some nights, when the wind turns and the streetlights blur, you can almost see them again. 3 men, 3 ghosts, 3 reflections of a dream that was never meant to last. Chicago still remembers its thunder. The city that once shook under Capone's laughter now hums softly beneath skyscrapers and sirens. But if you stand near the river on a quiet night, you can hear that laughter return, echoing between the bridges, gentle now, almost kind. He isn't angry anymore. He isn't a king or a monster. He's just part of the rain, one more drop in the long storm that built America's appetite for legends. Manhattan glows as it always has, bright enough to blind the stars. Somewhere high above Park Avenue, a single hotel lamp burns all night. The maid says she turns it off every evening, but each morning it's on again. Maybe it's just wiring. Maybe it's Luciano, still at his desk, reading reports from an empire that no longer exists. He doesn't speak now. He doesn't need to. The structure he imagined has outlived him. Every skyscraper, every corporation, every system built to last carries a little of his logic. Make it efficient, make it invisible, make it permanent. Even the city's reign follows rules. And Brooklyn, quiet, ordinary, eternal, still keeps its secrets under porch lights. When the drizzle settles over Howard Beach, the old fences glisten, and the bay smells of salt and memory. An old woman watering her roses pauses sometimes, listening to the hush between raindrops. She swears she can hear a voice there. A low, calm murmur saying, "Patience, always patience." Gambino's lesson, drifting through time like a lullaby. 3 cities. 3 ghosts. 3 ways of remembering power. One burned bright and fast. One built order from chaos. One kept the peace by pretending there was no war. Together they wrote a manual for control in a world that worshipped noise. They didn't invent greed or ambition. They only gave it choreography. Imagine them now, sitting once more around a table that doesn't exist. No whiskey, no guns, no smoke. Just rain against glass and the faint hum of a city that owes them its myths. Capone leans back, grin wide as ever. Luciano adjusts his tie, always precise. Gambino folds his hands, patient as stone. For a long moment they say nothing. Then Capone chuckles. "Guess they still talk about us, huh?" Luciano smiles. "They talk because they need stories." Gambino nods once. And stories need endings. Outside the window, lightning flashes. Not angry, just bright enough to show their outlines before the dark closes again. The thunder that follows sounds almost like applause. Time moves forward. The rain softens. The cities keep breathing. The people who once feared them now fall asleep to documentaries about them, to voices like mine telling their tales in the dark. It's funny, isn't it? The same rain that once washed blood from sidewalks now washes minds into rest. History rewritten as a lullaby. Somewhere a radio plays faint jazz, the kind Capone used to hum. Somewhere a hotel corridor echoes with footsteps no one can trace. Somewhere a garden gate swings open in the wind, though no hand touched it. These are the small reminders that legends never die. They simply lower their voices. So as you listen to the rain outside your own window, understand that you're hearing the last language of that world. The rhythm that outlived the noise. The under-nightlife they built isn't about crime anymore. It's about the quiet that follows. About how every city learns to sleep eventually, even the restless ones. Close your eyes. Let the storm recede. Picture the lights of Chicago fading into mist, the skyline of Manhattan disappearing behind rain, the porches of Brooklyn glowing like embers. 3 stories dissolving into one endless night. No moral. No judgment. Just weather. The rain keeps falling. The cities keep dreaming. And the architects of the under-nightlife finally rest. Not in glory, not in guilt, but in the calm they spent their lives chasing. Sleep now. You're part of their silence.